Afternoon and have not signed up over at that table, please do that. We need to make sure we can accommodate everybody, and it helps us to know who's here and who wants to testify. We have welcoming remarks this morning from Kent County Sheriff Michelle Latoy-Young, and I think we will start with that.
Good morning.
I was like, where are you?
Good morning. I was honored to be asked to give welcoming comments this morning, and I want to start by welcoming you to Kent County, Michigan, and Grand Rapids Community College, one of our wonderful community partners in educating and developing our workforces. So thank you so much for being here. We have worked hard to be leaders in local law enforcement and jail management. We are honored to be one of the locations you have chosen to consider so many big picture issues as it relates to criminal justice. The tasks you have all agreed to take on are pressing and will have dramatic impact on the safety of our community, the peace of mind of our crime victims, and the personal outcomes for the offenders involved in the system. I challenge you to strive to look at the system from the experience of the people who are part of it, the experiences of the victims, the experiences of the offenders, and even the professionals who engage in this endeavor of justice. There are many components of the current system that perform well and can be used as building blocks to build an even more effective system. In Kent County, we have promising outcomes with problem-solving courts, and specifically when they are paired with community partners and programs specifically selected for the needs of that offender. Within the correctional facility, we leverage programming to reduce recidivism. Using programs with cognitive behavior therapy, we facilitate completion of high school diplomas, high school GEDs, and we also have a biblical principle cohort, a sober living cohort, a thinking cohort, and other treatment options for people who have addiction issues, such as medically assisted treatment programs. As you know, the goal is always to give the offender the best support to allow a good transition to the community following incarceration. To this end, we have a robust work release program that strives to continue employment for those who have a job when they are incarcerated, and works to prepare somebody for employment and give them employment as they are released from the correctional facility. I would be remiss if I did not urge you to fully contemplate how mental health and addiction factor into the criminal offenses and incarceration. Please consider that looking at just part of a picture, such as the gravity of the current offense, you may miss that the criminal behavior is sometimes an outcome of a person in crisis. And although jail is not the best place to deal with a crisis, it is often the only accessible place for this person. If that is removed and not replaced with other resources, the crisis will continue, and potential for additional criminal behavior, additional victims, and additional negative outcomes for the offender is there. As a snapshot in Kent County, we have 30% of our inmate population currently receiving treatment for mental illness. 10% of them are considered severely mentally impaired, and many of them have nowhere to go upon release. I would advocate that any system changes must include in every case of incarceration an evaluation of the needs of the offender and what program best suits their needs. We have a system of people, and it's incumbent on us to treat each of those people, both sides of the crime, with empathy, respect, and support. As the Sheriff of Kent County, I want to thank you for your work on this board and for being willing to consider all of these large issues. Bless you.
Thank you, Sheriff, and good morning again to everyone. We want to move forward now by taking the roll of the task force members. I'm going to go through and call every task force member's name, and if the members here, if their proxies here, would you please respond with the President. The Honorable Justice Bridget McCormack.
Here. Oh, present. That's what you told me to say. Follow the rules. Present.
I'm Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist. I am present. Dr. Amanda Alexander.
Present.
Honorable Judge Thomas Boyd.
Present.
Sheriff Jerry Clayton. Craig DeRoche.
Present.
Honorable Prentice Edwards.
Maria Lattis-Hoop, 60th District Court Judge, is here as a proxy for him. Thank you.
Thank you. William Gutzweiler.
Here.
DJ Hilson.
Here.
Monica Janner.
Here.
Dr. Cheryl Kubiak.
Here.
Lieutenant Jim Miller.
Present.
Representative Mike Miller.
Present.
Takura. Present. Never try to say the last name.
Present.
The Honorable Dana Nessel.
Good morning, John Pallas, proxy for Attorney General Dana Nessel, present.
Bill Peterson.
Present.
Senator Runstead.
Good morning, Linda Hyatt, District Director for the Senate 15th District, present.
Thank you. Senator Santana.
Present.
Commissioner Talon.
Present.
Robert Verheugen.
Present.
Representative Yancey.
Present.
That completes the roll. Thank you, everyone. All right, we'll right into the adoption of our minutes from our August meeting in Traverse City. Do you have a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The minutes are adopted. Now we have a couple of announcements. I'd like to move to Prosecutor Hilton for an update on the Prosecutor Roundtable.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Back in the end of July, we had a roundtable with the Pew folks. So present for Pew were Terry Schuster, Quentin Weld, and Gracie Berger. From our shop, there was myself, as at that time I was the president of the association, Bill Valancourt, who is now the president, was president-elect at the time, Livingston County, Melissa Powell, Iron County prosecutor, Matt Wiese, Doug Lloyd, Paul Spagnola, Chris Becker, and then some staff. So we had a representation of both small Upper Peninsula as well as large Lower Peninsula counties in this meeting. And we had a really nice, robust discussion. We talked a lot about jail population with our members, talking about their experiences working with their local sheriffs and county jails, and trying to work through, obviously, the issues that we each have depending on the size of our jail, the size of our county, and the size of our county budgets. We also talked a lot about pretrial release and talking about the ability or the inability really for prosecutors to attend arraignments because of staffing resources and not being present. In particular with the new MIDC standards and having defense lawyers present, we feel that we'd be able to get a lot of work done working together with the defense bar if we had the resources in order to do that. That's true also for the arraignment conversation that we had. We did have a lot of conversation about mental health issues and substance abuse issues, which certainly for prosecutors we see that as well as the defense bar. We see that as an issue, and we certainly see that as an area where not only we can be strong partners on trying to resolve some of those issues, but also working with the state and finding ways that we can turn our jails into what they're meant for, and not substance abuse treatment centers and mental health wings. Certainly we talked a lot about overcrowding and the problem with that. From our standpoint as prosecutors, we also had a conversation about restitution for victims as well as victim support services. Certainly, we can, as prosecutors, we can never forget that we are certainly representing the state of Michigan, but we're also representing victims of crime who did not choose to be part of the system. So finding ways that we can make sure they are made whole, whether it be financially or otherwise, as well as support services for them as they go through the traumatic process of the criminal justice system, just as the offender does, were all important parts of this conversation. So that, like I said, we spent, well over an hour with them, and it was, I think, a very robust give and take between our association and the members of Pew, so I appreciate them taking the time to do that.
The next thing we want to bring everyone's attention to are the upcoming events that are connected with our work. Tonight, after our meeting, there is a community reception hosted by the Greater Grand Rapids Advocates and Leaders for Police and Community Trust. That's from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the Link Up Gallery. Tuesday and Wednesday, September 24th and 25th, there is pretrial justice training hosted by the Oakland County Community Corrections and the Michigan Department of Corrections Office of Community Corrections. Both days, that training runs from 8:30 to 5, and there's a reception Tuesday from 5 to 6 at the Lansing Center in Lansing. Tuesday, October 17th, the Wayne County Jail discussion is going to be hosted by the Hudson Weber Foundation and the Wayne County Jail Working Group. The presentations run from 3 to 5, and there is a reception from 5 to 8, and that'll be held at Wayne State University. And finally, task force members are invited to a Genesee County jail visit, and that's on Thursday, October 31st from 10 to 1, and that's on Saginaw Street in Flint. There is a handout at your desk with the details of all of that, in case you didn't write it all down while I was talking. I think we're going to talk about protocol for public testimony at the start of the public testimony when we have a better sense of how many folks we have. If that's okay with you guys. Okay, so Michelle, Terry.
Good morning, everybody. Morning. So today we're very excited to talk with you about data and dive into it. And I'm actually not joking. This task force has been asked to examine who's coming into jail, how long they stay, and why. And before today, it hasn't really been possible to do that statewide. And so we've got a whole lot of information to cover today. This is our first cut at it, won't be the only cut. And I'm going to start with some refresher slides of information that we were able to gather from national data sources before we get into local Michigan data. So this will be a refresher for task force members and for some people in the audience, and also new for some people in the audience. For anybody who would like to spend more time with any of the slides shown today, the task force website is where everything's going to be put up on the task force website. So if you already know that, great, or know where that is, great. If you don't know where that website is, it's up here on this first slide, and it's also written down on slips of paper over by the testimony sign-up table. So we're going to do 5 quick refresher slides. First, and this is important for today's presentation, jails are really high traffic institutions, and they have lots more admissions every year than state prisons. So here's a slide showing the United States jail and prison admissions and population, and you can see the county jails have 18 times more admissions in a year compared to state prisons. Michigan's jail population tripled over a relatively short period of time, and that growth in the jail population was driven pretty equally between the pretrial population and the sentenced population. Jail populations have remained pretty high, even in the last 10 years, while arrests have come down really significantly and jail admissions have come down really significantly. And they've remained high because lengths of stay in jail are getting longer. In Michigan, the number of women in county jails is growing much faster than the number of men in county jails. And the last refresher slide is that the number of people in rural jails or rural jail populations are growing a lot faster than jail populations in urban, suburban, and small and mid-sized counties. So today we're going to start at this 30,000 foot level and go down to 10,000 feet. We're going to be looking at data gathered by the Michigan State Police from 600 law enforcement agencies across the state. We're going to be looking at court data from across the state, and we're going to be looking at a large sample of jail data. What we've done, like we did in the last presentation in July, what we've done for this presentation is try to draw your attention to notable trends and findings that we think are going to be useful for your policy discussions later in the year. The data are not going to be able to answer every question, so you all have to draw on your collective knowledge of how justice systems work in the state. You'll have to look to your peers across the state and practitioners and members of the public. We'll come back next time and we'll be presenting some more data and also some more context about the laws and practices in Michigan that help explain jail population dynamics. And where we have follow-up questions, we'll try to answer those with data, but data aren't going to answer all the questions. Here's where we are on our calendar. We started in July with our kickoff meeting in Detroit, and then last month we were up in Traverse City where we heard from members of the public from northern part of Michigan. We also heard presentations on the relevant research and constitutional landscape for jail and pretrial policy discussions. Today we're talking about data. We're here in Grand Rapids. We're going to hear from members of the public from western part of the state. There's 2 data presentations today. The first one is going to cover arrest and courts and jail data. And then the second presentation is focused on the prevalence of mental illness in jails and here in Michigan, and we're going to get that presentation from Wayne State University's Center for Behavioral Health and Justice. Then we come back next month in Detroit. We're going to hear from members of the public in southeast Michigan. We'll get some more data then, and we're going to be looking at laws and practices that everybody needs a working knowledge of before we get into policy discussions later in the year. And then you can see on the calendar we've got several rounds of subgroup meetings for policy discussions. Here's a little roadmap of where we're headed with this presentation. We've collected 10 years worth of arrest data and court data statewide, and 3 years worth of jail data from 20 jails. That's a large sample of jails in the state. And I think something I want to say here is what's difficult about this idea of trying to say across the state who's coming into jail, how long they're staying, and why, is that these data are not housed in one place. They're housed in lots of different scattered data sets. They're collected in different ways. So members of law enforcement or agencies for law enforcement, courts, and jails all collect data for their own missions, and so their case management systems are designed for their needs, and they're not necessarily designed to lend themselves to statewide policy analysis. So all that to say, it took some work to get this data together. I want to thank Sheriff LaJoy Young. I want to thank Lieutenant Miller. I thank Sheriff Clayton, who's not here today, and the Sheriff's Association for being core partners in this work. They've really showed up with curiosity and with urgency and done a lot to make sure that you all would have this data today. This is the first time really in the state's history when we have this much data on who's coming into jails and how long they stay. So we're excited to show it to you. We're really glad to be able to present it today. Also want to thank the State Court Administrative Office and the Michigan State Police for their help gathering data from all of the criminal trial courts across the state and from all of the law enforcement agencies across the state. So now we're going to jump right in. We're going to start with arrest data, and I'm going to hand it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Terry. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay. Like Terry said, we're going to start with arrest data. Throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, just feel free to speak up and we can try and address them in the moment. And I believe at the end of this presentation, we'll still have plenty of time for further questions. So to start with a little context on Michigan arrest data. In the next dozen slides or so, we're going to look at arrest trends in Michigan over the last decade. The Michigan State Police compiles this information with participation from 600 police and sheriff's departments. Since 2008, the state has been using incident-based crime reporting, which tracks a greater number of individual offenses and information than what you typically see in standard UCR reporting. In the slides, we've referred to arrest events, which include people arrested on warrants, people arrested when law enforcement observe a violation of the law, and people who are issued a citation or a summons in court in lieu of an arrest. A couple more notes before we dive in. An arrest event could involve multiple criminal charges for the person being taken into custody. The data that is captured here is capturing the most serious charge, and it is counting that person only once. Secondly, a citation involves directing the person to appear in court on a specific date. They're often called appearance tickets. In Michigan, officers can use citations instead of making an arrest only for misdemeanors that are punishable by 93 days or less, with some exclusions. As crime continues to fall in Michigan, so have arrests. Between 2008 and 2018, arrests dropped 22% from about 300,000 per year to less than 250,000 last year. There are still hundreds of thousands of arrests each year, but they're on the decline. Even though Michigan's population, the state resident population, dipped slightly between 2009 and 2010, the arrest rate for the state is also on the decline. The number of arrests for 100,000 residents in the state in Michigan declined by this period by 20%. And as additional context, over the same time period, the property crime rate in Michigan fell 38%, and the violent crime rate fell 13%. Like most statewide trends, an overall decline doesn't always mean uniform decline across the state. In this map, the color legend represents the change in arrest rates between 2008 and 2018. And we can see that a handful of counties saw significant declines, those counties in the darkest blue. Most saw modest declines, those in the light blue, and about 1 in 4 counties experienced increases in arrest rates, shaded in that dark orange. It's worth noting that for many of the counties that saw increases in arrest rates, their resident population isn't very large, so the change in total arrests wasn't big enough to have an impact on the statewide trend. The next few slides will break out arrest trends across different demographic groups. Here we're looking at the portion of arrests for males and females in 2008 and 2018. Over this period, the number of women and men both declined. Female arrests fell by about 12%, from 74,000 to 66,000, while the number of men arrested fell 25%, from roughly 236,000 to 170,000. Because the number of men arrested is declining faster than it is for women, women now make up a slightly larger portion of all arrests, 28% in 2018 compared to 25% in 2008. While this demographic change is relatively subtle, we'll see a more dramatic shift in the next slide when we look at trends by age. On this slide, we're looking at arrest numbers for different age groups over time. The red lines track arrest numbers each year for people aged 25 or younger. The orange line tracks arrest numbers for those aged 26 to 35. And the blue line represents arrests for those aged 36 to 50. And finally, the turquoise line at the bottom shows arrest numbers for each year for those over the age of 50. So looking at the red line, the youngest cohort, we can see that back in 2008, they were arrested in far higher numbers than anyone else, double the arrest numbers for the next 2 age categories. But by 2018, their arrest numbers were basically cut in half. That is a very big drop in arrest, and it accounts for nearly all of the statewide decline in arrests over the last decade. Police are arresting or citing far fewer young people than they used to. The next 2 age cohorts went in different directions. There was a 10% increase in arrests for 26 to 35-year-olds and a 17% decrease in arrests for 36 to 50-year-olds. And then a notable trend for those over the age of 50. As a cohort, they're still arrested in far smaller numbers than everyone else, but those numbers have increased 30% in just the last 10 years. On the next slide, we'll look just at the red and turquoise lines, the cohorts that saw the biggest changes, and break them out by race. Here we've kept the color legend the same, so red still represents arrest numbers for people 25 years old or younger, and turquoise represents arrest numbers for people over the age of 50. And each color is broken out to show the trends for white and black people in that age group. So the thick lines track arrests for white people, and the thin lines track arrests for black people. Looking first at the red lines, representing white and black young people, we see that in 2008, there are far more arrests for white people under the age of 25 than for black people under the age of 25, more than double. In the decades since then, both groups have experienced significant drops in arrest, 55% for young white people and 30% for young black people. For young black people, that amounts to about 15,000 fewer arrests in 2018 than in 2008. And for young white people, it amounts to about 50,000 fewer arrests. Among the over 50 age group, the trend lines are closer. We see a 41% increase in arrest numbers for white people over the age of 50, and a 35% increase in arrest numbers for black people over the age of 50. This next slide includes people of all ages and breaks out information by race and sex. It also looks at arrest rates rather than arrest numbers. So if you look at the first bar on the left, it lines up with a vertical axis at around 1,800. That means that in 2008, about 1,800 white men were arrested for every 100,000 white men in the state of Michigan. And if you look at the first turquoise bar, it lines up with a vertical axis at around 4,800. That means in 2008, about 4,800 black men were arrested for every 100,000 black men in the state of Michigan. There are a couple of notable takeaways here. The first is just that black men and black women are arrested at higher rates than white men and white women. The second takeaway is that arrest rates dropped significantly in the last decade for most of the groups. They dropped 29% for white men, 17% for white women, and 18% for black men. But they stayed relatively flat, increasing by 2% for black women. On this slide, we're looking at 10-year arrest trends, but now we're focused on the criminal charges that saw the biggest change. So the table on the left shows the biggest drop in arrest numbers. Here we see big drops in arrest events for things like drunk driving, which dropped by over 40%, minor in possession of alcohol, which dropped by 90%, and shoplifting, which fell by 30%. The table on the right shows the biggest increase in arrest numbers. Masked beneath the overall decline in arrest are some significant increases in arrest events for meth and heroin possession, probation violations, and contempt of court. The change in contempt of court arrest increased by 12%, probation violations increased by 20%, narcotic equipment violations by 61%, possession of heroin by 89%, and the possession of methamphetamine has doubled many times over in this 10-decade span. Between just 2014 and 2018, arrest events for possession of methamphetamine have quadrupled. But despite these increases, it's worth noting that possession of meth and heroin still make up a pretty small portion of all drug arrests. They make up about 12% of all arrests for violation of the Controlled Substances Act, while possession of marijuana makes up 45%. On this slide, we're just looking at arrest events last year in 2018 and listing the top 10 most common criminal charges. Again, in instances where a single arrest event involved multiple criminal charges, this data is tracking what the officer indicated was the most serious or primary charge. Topping the chart is failure to appear. In just under 30,000 arrest events, failure to appear at court was the most serious charge. These were almost entirely warrant arrests. Next on the list are assault, drunk driving, and marijuana possession. And in the top 10, we also see two different categories of shoplifting: retail theft in the third degree, which is any amount up to $200, and retail theft in the second degree, which is still a misdemeanor, so it's under $1,000. Or with a prior. Or with, thank you, Judge. And three types of offenses related to court process violations more broadly. So we have contempt of court, obstructing justice, and probation violations. On this next slide, we're taking a look back at 10 years for the 5 most common arrest events that we just saw in 2018, and we see that arrests have fallen for all 5. OUI, operating under the influence, used to be the most arrested crime in the state, and even with a substantial decline in the last decade, it still lands in the top 5. Failure to appear, marijuana possession, and shoplifting also hold spots in the top 5 despite declines in arrest numbers for those charges. Those colors might be a little bit hard to see, so at the very top that declines 7% is failure to appear, followed by simple assault in a turquoise, which declined by 1%, so relatively flat, which is followed by that dark gray drop in OUI. The orange line is marijuana possession, which fell by 13%, and finally at the bottom is retail fraud theft in the 3rd degree, which fell by 30% as well.
Michelle, I have a question about this. So on failure to appear, in particular, there seemed to be an inflection point in that graph in 2011. Is there any explanation of that?
I don't have any explanation for that. We'll have to talk to more practitioners about what that might be about. I think when we looked, yeah, I'm not sure what's behind that kind of dip. But we'll make note of that and look into that more. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. All right, so in the next slide, we're going to break down what arrest events mean. So nearly all arrest events are actually arrests rather than citations. This donut graph shows in 2 shades of blue the 2 types of custodial arrests, warrant arrests and on-view arrests, and in orange, the portion of arrest events that were citations and summons. Recall that a citation is an appearance ticket with a date to appear for a court hearing. A summons is similar but issued by the court itself rather than by a police officer. In 2018, a citation or summons to appear in court was used in place of an arrest in only 10% of arrest events. The rest were split pretty evenly between custodial arrests made with and without a warrant. There was also a fair amount of variation across the state in how often citations were used. So together, rural counties issued citations in 8% of arrest events, while suburban counties issued citations the most frequently at 12%. But variation was also spread out even amongst counties of similar urbanicities. So some rural counties issued citations in less than 5% of arrest events, while other rural counties issued citations in 20% or more of cases. A similar, pretty wide range was seen across suburban counties and mid-sized counties too. So it seems pretty county-specific, the variation in how often citations are used. On this graph, we kept the same color coding and we're tracking arrests and citations over time. We see declines in arrests with a warrant, arrests without a warrant, and in citations in lieu of arrest. But proportionally, the decline was much bigger for citations. In 2008, citations were used in nearly 40,000 cases, but by 2018, that number had dropped to closer to 22,000 cases, a 42% decline. Custodial arrests declined too, 20% for arrests with a warrant and 18% for on-view arrests. So this next table shows the most common charges in 2018 where a citation or a summons was used in lieu of an arrest. They include things like open container violations, disorderly conduct, and marijuana possession. And citations were used in about half of those cases, in less than half of those cases. Miscellaneous arrest here is the exact description in the data, so we don't have any more specific information about what that could or doesn't include. There are a lot of offenses that by statute aren't eligible for citations, so officers don't have discretion in those cases about whether to issue a citation or make a custodial arrest. But one of the big takeaways here is that even with offenses where officers have discretion to issue a citation, they're only choosing to do so some of the time. So looking at shoplifting, for example, retail fraud, theft at the third degree at the bottom of the table, we see that citations are issued in only 22% of cases, while in the other 78% of cases, an officer is choosing to make a custodial arrest. So next we're going to transition into looking at just a few graphs about court data.
I'm sorry, before we get into court data, I have a few questions that I was trying to save to the end of your presentation on arrest data. Were there, when you collected data, it was just broken down by black and white, were there other races included at all, or how were they categorized if so?
There was also, the other categories were American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, but they were used less than 3% of the time, so we didn't show them here on this graph, but we can pull those arrest rates also and provide them to
But
you.
they weren't included or categorized as one or the other that you did include in the graph? They were categorized on their, out on their own?
Correct.
And Arab American as well?
And what is well?
Arab American as well?
I don't believe that's one of the racial categories that's used in the arrest data. There are a couple others other than black and white that I can go back and pull for the task force, but they're used pretty infrequently, so it was very small numbers to try to share also.
And then how, do you know if you do have it, the information, how many had come back as unknown? I know of cases where people have brought to my attention where the ticket or the citation would say unknown for race when they're clearly black.
Unknown, yeah, it was another category that's there that was used it was like about 3%, but we can pull those others and kind of provide that to you.
Thank you.
I have a question. What is the reason for separating the citation versus custodial arrest in your data?
I think in terms of, for our scoping, the impact of jail populations, a custodial arrest is, in the majority of cases, taken directly to
Because
jail.
with citations, I mean, they're often still lodged. At least in our county, they are.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
I know we're not supposed to talk amongst ourselves.
No, please.
Well, they're still lodged. I mean, if someone's given a citation, they're still lodged on the citation. So the citation would not necessarily make a difference in terms of your data.
It makes a huge difference on process for the person going through the system to be put in a police car and brought in and booked versus having something that you have to respond to by showing up at the court.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Often they're given a citation, but they are lodged on the citation.
Oh, that's what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're not given a citation and
Right.
released and told to come to court. And
Right,
apparently
that happens like 90% of the time. They mark on the bottom of the ticket, lodged, or they mark appear on whatever their list of arraignment dates are.
So as it relates to the data, what the judge is saying is that the terms citation and appearance ticket may not be synonyms.
That is correct. I mean, I would say, and I'm from Muskegon County, I'm a district court judge there, taking just proxy for Judge Edwards. And actually, our prosecutor could probably give even better data than I could. I would say 90% of our citation, well, it's hard to say, but I would say almost there are many operating while intoxicated or operating while visibly impaired citations. All of those people are lodged. There are many retail fraud citations. Some of those are lodged. Many driving while license suspended citations, those are lodged. Very few are not lodged.
And then they're subject to your...
So your data may be it will be incorrect for Muskegon County. I can't speak for others.
That makes them subject to your interim bond schedule? Is that what happens?
That is correct. So they will be arrested, they will be processed through the jail, and that really the police officer makes that call. Other than we do have general policy, I would say that if it's an operating while intoxicated or visibly impaired, they're always going to get lodged. So your data will be incorrect if you have Muskegon County.
So the big takeaway from the citation slides, or the big couple of takeaways, are they represent a fairly small portion of arrest events, and they've been declining pretty significantly in the last 10 years. So add to that even those marked as citations, that maybe not all of them actually are appearance tickets sort of released to the community. So in your policy discussions about the use of citations, we'll sort of take all of that into account and be asking the questions about what the law ought to be around the use of citations versus arrest.
Right. I mean, I could see that being something that would be looked at as the task force, but that is not the present circumstance in citations in Michigan.
I had a question as well.
Thank you for sharing that. We can try and decipher like what estimated % of that group is actually being lodged versus a very small part that's not. Yeah.
Thank you. Michelle, you had said that arrest rates decreased for all major groups except black women. Mm-hmm. Can you talk more about why that was? So why arrest rates increased among black women?
I don't have with me right now kind of the changes in the categories of offenses. Mm-hmm. We do have a breakdown for that later in kind of our jail sample that might be reflective of what we see in arrests, and we can definitely pull that for you. In general, women typically are arrested for more property offenses, mm-hmm. But we can definitely grab the top for offenses for black women and see how they compare.
Thank you.
Michelle, under this chart you have on here about 10 most arrests, and you got probation. Is parole included in that?
In probation violation? That probation violation category is just probation.
Okay, so parole didn't make the top 10.
I don't believe parole made the top 10, but I will definitely double check on that.
Well,
right.
So a parole violation would result in return to prison and not a jail, right?
Not necessarily.
No, okay. And then so probation violations, do you have a breakdown of what types of violations? Are there serious violations? Are they, do you have that information?
We don't. The probation violation category can kind of include anything that's a violation, so that could be something that's kind of allegations of a more serious charge, or it could be something that people would think is less serious, like drug testing issues or failure to report to their officer. So I think you've kind of isolated that category could include like a wide variety of seriousness, and is something we'll try to investigate more to get a sense of what's included in there. Mm-hmm.
Wondering if you could provide a little more context to the decline in marijuana arrests. And what I'm looking for is where decriminalization efforts were taking place around the state. I know in Grand Rapids it was passed in a voter initiative in 2012, but then it was late 2015 before suits and so on were resolved, and it went into effect. So I wonder what other places in the state were decriminalizing and whether that might contribute to that decline.
I think we heard more broadly what you identified, which is that there have been a lot of policy decisions that have affected that decline. I don't know much more about kind of the timing of specific regional adoptions, but we can add that to our list to kind of investigate.
Thank you.
Michelle, in regards to the decrease in the number of arrests, was there any consideration given to going back 10 years on staffing levels for each one of those agencies for patrol staffing? That may be an influx of why the decrease in arrests, especially on drunk driving. Correct.
Yes, the 2008 to 2018 snapshot was just the kind of time period when across the state they were all using incident-based crime reporting, so it was kind of that reliable period of time where we could track offenses. But we'll reach back out to Michigan State Police and see if we can learn more about staffing levels, if they, I'm not sure if they track that information at sheriff's offices. Do you know,
Approximately what their staffing levels were 10 years ago compared to what they are now. And with the constant budget cuts that officers, our agencies are dealing with, we're losing those patrol officers every year.
The Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards is a division of the state police, and they track that by agency.
Great. We'll definitely follow up with them and bring that back for you.
That's going to explain that map there. Those agencies that didn't lose officers are the ones that maintain their arrest rate, and the ones that the officers went down, that's where you're going to find that the drunk drivings went down. Just fewer cops on the street.
We'll definitely look into that. That's a good thought. Thank you.
Michelle, I had one more question about the last slide. The slide about the top most cited common offenses being cited less than half the time. So I'm wondering about racial disparities when officers would choose to issue a citation versus arrest someone.
Yeah, we did in some of our earlier cuts looked at that, and nothing jumped out as a huge trend, but we can still pull that table together and provide it for you.
Thank you.
All right, well, diving into the court data next, and this is a much kind of shorter set of data slides. So the State Court Administrative Office collects information from Michigan's 105 district courts and 57 circuit courts about case filings and dispositions. We've also undertaken a multi-year effort to collect individual level court data in a very large judicial data warehouse. Our analysis here is drawing out reported case filing data and is looking specifically at the years 2008 to 2018, just to match it up with kind of the time period we had with arrests. And we're also going to look at some high-level trends now, but we'll return to this data set again in October. So this is just a bit of landscape.
I just want to know, did you use all counties, and if not, how many counties did you use?
This includes all district courts and circuit courts, so all counties.
Okay, thanks.
One piece of information that we can get from the court data that's not always apparent in arrest data is whether the charges are misdemeanors or felonies. So we thought it was worthwhile to flag that now. So there are about 1,900 different misdemeanor level offenses in Michigan statutes and many more local ordinance misdemeanors. And those are generally resolved by the district courts. And there are about 750 different felony level offenses in Michigan statutes. These are generally resolved by the circuit courts.
About a third of the felony filings got relieved in district court.
Right. So here we're looking at the number of cases filed in district court. This includes misdemeanors, felonies, and criminal traffic cases, some of which aren't tracked in the arrest data, making these numbers greater than what we saw in some of the arrest slides. In lighter blue are misdemeanors, and in dark blue are felonies. The first thing that stands out in this slide is that misdemeanors far outnumber felony cases in Michigan's courts. 2018, misdemeanors accounted for 86% of all criminal case filings. The second trend we see is that as crime and arrests have fallen, so have case filings. Misdemeanors declined by 22%, while felony cases declined by 14%.
This, something to note here is we've shifted from arrests to cases filed, and that's why the number is higher, correct? So we've gone from roughly 300 down to 250,000 people to how many charges were filed against them. That's why it's up at 700,000.
We believe that's part of it, and the other part of it is largely criminal traffic cases, which aren't always captured in the micro data set, but are criminal and go through the court process.
But is that also a factor if I had two charges on one case?
The case, it wouldn't be counting each charge within a case, it would be counting the case. I think there might likely be court variation, though, about how often cases are consolidated for a person if they had kind of an old case and then they get picked up on a new charge if those are brought together. And maybe the judges here can kind of speak to that.
There's an SAO standard. We probably can get somebody from SAO to explain. The idea is you don't want courts to, or prosecutors conspiring with courts to say we have 3 times as many cases by filing 3 offenses from the same moment, because then you'll need more judicial resources. So it's a shell game. So the SCAO has standards. If someone's arrested on one occasion, you're supposed to charge everything on that occasion on one document. Does it always work? I think that the observation that there's local practices is real, but there is a standard that says, no, you should not have 3 charges on 3 different pieces of paper, 3 different case filings, because then you can pad your numbers like how many judges you need.
But you were asking about the correspondence between arrest numbers and case numbers, and it's 1 arrest and 1 case for the most part, I think is correct.
Yeah, so was my question, because everything here is based on a different population as we look at the courts versus the policing numbers. I was just saying that for the good of the order for the board here.
I think if you're arrested on 5 charges, it's 1 arrest, and if you go to court and there are 5 charges, it's still 1 charge. I think it's the traffic data that's making up the difference. I just want to...
Well, the other reason that we make sure that it's all 1 arrest with every charge is because if you separate them, there's a risk of adjudicating a part of the case that may negatively affect the defendant's defenses. For example, it could be a bad stop on a narcotics case, but the charge is driving while license suspended or driving without a taillight, and that stop for that particular issue could revolve around the entire 10-year felony. So it's critical to have everything all together. And I think judges work really hard to make sure that everything's together, not just for case filing, but for defenses for the defendant.
So as is fairly typical, Judge Hoops went right to the good public policy reason, and I went right to the evil in the hearts of men reason.
It's helpful to hear both sides to understand it. So the next trend from the case data is that we see that many cases filed end up getting dismissed. So this slide shows case resolutions for district court in the bar on the left and circuit court in the bar on the right. District court here are showing the dispositions of misdemeanors, including those that may have been charged originally as a felony and then reduced to a misdemeanor and resolved in district court. Circuit court generally contains felony cases.
I'm curious whether we could find out how many of those cases are resolved while people are in custody, because it's been my experience that a lot of times, first time I come in contact with somebody, they say, get any piece of paper for me to sign so I can get out of here. And a lot of times, by the time you get to circuit court, you've spent so much time in jail that, time served. So I'm just curious how many of those people are in custody when those cases are resolved.
And I think Terry kind of mentioned this in the intro about criminal justice systems being kind of tracked separately in these silos. So today we're kind of presenting each silo on its own. Here's what we see in arrests, here's what we see in courts, and we can see kind of mirrors in a lot of the trends, but are missing some of those gaps. Our hope is that with kind of the jail sample we have and the court data that's provided, we'll be able to, in October, track cases moving through the system in that way to see, when might a dismissal be happening? Was it after this period when they were in jail and so forth? So in district court, as you all can clearly see, nearly half of cases are dismissed, and a smaller portion are dismissed in circuit court. That's the light blue segment on each bar. Nearly all the rest of the cases resolved with a guilty plea. 56% of cases in district court and 87% of cases in circuit court. Very few cases actually went to trial. Only 3% of circuit court cases and 1% of district court cases, and that's represented by the orange segments of the bar graph. These dismissals can be initiated by either the prosecutor or the judge. A prosecutor can choose to dismiss a charge at any time from before the arraignment through the day of the trial, while the judge can dismiss a charge if they find probable cause that the charge does not exist. So it captures kind of both of those dismissal categories. The next 2 slides are just quick, simple demographic looks at this court data set as it stands on its own. So here we're just looking at criminal cases by males and females, and we see that a third of criminal defendants are women, and that's slightly more than in arrests. That might have something to do with the criminal traffic cases that are in the court data that weren't captured in arrest. But we'll try and dig into this a bit more. This next slide is just looking at the age of defendants, and we can see it's pretty similar between men and women, but female defendants are a bit younger overall than the male defendants. Those are our quick snapshot of the court data, and like we alluded to, we're going to try to come back to it more in October, but before we move on to data from the sample of jail counties, are there other kind of questions or things you want to flag for us to investigate further related to these slides? On to jail data. So we've collected 3 years of data on admissions and length of stay from 20 counties, jails across Michigan. This is a large sample that took quite a bit of work to gather and aggregate, and I think you'll find the data really useful. These 20 counties represent 45% of the resident population across the state. Back in July, we spent some time discussing the differences between jails and prisons, and Terry covered that a little bit in the beginning here too. But some notes more for the audience's benefit. Jails are operated by sheriffs and supported by county budgets, while prisons are operated and paid for by the state. The people held in state prisons are convicted of felonies and high court misdemeanors, while those held in county jails could be serving a felony sentence of less than a year, serving a sentence for a misdemeanor or local ordinance violation, awaiting trial, held for a probation violation, or held on the behalf of another authority like MDOC or another jail. Here's the map showing the participating counties. Again, I want to echo Terry's thanks for the sheriffs and jail administrators in each of these counties for the work they've done to help the task force gather this data. The counties here represent different geographic parts of the state and contain counties with a wide range of population sizes. Several of the jail's task force members on this task force are also on a separate working group that's analyzing jail population data from Wayne County with the help of Vera Institute. They'll be sharing takeaways from the Wayne County jail data with us in October. So rather than duplicate their work, we've worked with 20 other counties that include urban, suburban, mid-sized, and rural populations. So this sample includes more than 100,000 admissions each year for 3 years. Because this time period doesn't allow for much trend over time analysis, many of our graphs refer to all admissions or releases within this 3-year period to have kind of a greater sample size. The right table looks at the distribution of this jail sample by urbanicity. So we see that 18% of the sample is coming from jails in rural counties, 33% from smaller mid-sized counties, 30% from suburban counties, and 19% from the urban county that's hosting us today. So first, we see that jails aren't necessarily the same across urbanicity. We see that rural counties in our sample had higher jail admissions per capita than urban, suburban, or small to mid-sized counties, while suburban counties had the lowest jail admissions per capita, about a third of the admissions rate for rural areas. It's worth noting that this trend is also mirrored when looking at arrest rates. So when we are looking at arrest rates, rural counties have the highest number of arrests per 100,000 residents, and suburban counties have the lowest number of arrests per 100,000 residents. While there are differences in jails by urbanicity like this one, we generally keep the rest of the presentation, we keep the sample together throughout. We have a fairly even distribution, so we can look at dynamics and trends for this full cohort, knowing that we're including a diverse range of jails across the state. Here we're looking at the number of jail admissions by age. This includes all jail admissions in our sample between 2016 and 2018. The peak age for jail admission, highlighted here in orange, is 26. People in their 20s are entering jails in higher numbers than people in other age groups, and about 2/3 of all people admitted were 35 or younger. So the number of people younger than 25 who entered jails was roughly 3 times the number of people over the age of 50. But similar to what we saw in the arrest data, even just between 2016 and 2018, a pretty short period of time, there's a noticeable drop in the number of young people entering jails. And we see a small increase during those years in admissions for those over the age of 50.
Excuse me, if I could just ask one question. It seems to be there's a trend towards older people being arrested more and older people being incarcerated, at least in jails, slightly more. Is there any explanation that you could give us that might tell us why that seems to be happening over the last decade or so? Thank you.
We'll definitely dig into it more. What I can say is that these trends, we see that in national data too. So young people are being arrested at lower rates and people over the age of 50 are being arrested more. We'll definitely provide the data table with more details, but people over the age of 50 are also arrested for kind of OWI at higher rates and some assault offenses too.
Is this just admissions or serving? Just admissions?
Yes. And the next several slides will be looking just at this jail admissions cohort. So in total for that group on the right, even though they're smaller than the group that's younger than 25, they make up about 11% of all jail admissions in our sample. So these two stacked bars represent demographic distributions. The top one looks at the resident population of counties represented in our jail sample, and the bottom one looks at jail admissions. The blue segments of the bar represent white men and women, making up 39% and 15% of jail admissions respectively, and the orange segments of the bar represent black men and women, making up 26% and 8% of jail admissions respectively. And the turquoise segments represent jail admissions where the race recorded in the data was another category or unknown, often less than 3%, but we can pull that data for you. So while the proportion of white men in our jail sample is similar to that in the resident population, white women are underrepresented in the jail sample, 15% of all jail admissions, while making up 41% of the resident population. Black men make up 26% of jail admissions, but only 6% of the resident population of the sample. And black women make up 8% of all jail admissions and 6% of the resident population in the sample. So most jail admissions were for misdemeanors. In our sample of roughly 325,000 jail admissions, the most serious charge was a misdemeanor in 61% of the cases and was a felony for 36% of the cases. So most people are entering jail for lower level crimes. The felony misdemeanor categorization was provided in the jail data that we relied on, but we could investigate to see how they are categorizing them. I'm assuming they're following the law of how to categorize them.
Forgive me if we've already covered this, but if someone was duly charged with both a felony and a misdemeanor, how did you count that?
We counted the most serious charge, so a felony. And which is a good segue into our next slide, which is looking at the 10 most common offenses at admission, where we tried to capture the most serious charge at admission. So as you read through this list, you might notice that these offenses aren't as specific as the criminal charges we saw earlier when looking at arrest data. That's because while arresting agencies in Michigan all use one standardized set of charges to track criminal charges, jails in Michigan do not. Some jails use microcodes, which are the code systems used by Michigan State Police, and the arrest codes we saw earlier. Some use PAC codes, which are the prosecuting attorney's coordinating counsel's charges and kind of loosely correlate directly to statute. So because we had both of those codes within our sample, we had to, and they didn't match up one-to-one, we had to create kind of broader categories that could capture microcodes and PAC codes. Yes.
Another clarity thing here is operating while under the influence. These are admissions to the county jail, not the drunk tank at the city, or do they both count as an admission?
Into the county jails. So this isn't data from a police lockup or a drunk tank.
Sorry for my inappropriate description of it. I've slept in a couple of them in my life, so I call them something different.
Technical legal term.
Yes.
It's easier to remember that. I couldn't think of a different term. Yeah. So a benefit of these broader categories is that we can capture a lot of the admissions. So, and we can have an understanding of the bulk of admissions entering jail. So we can see that 8% of all admissions, tens of thousands of people in this sample, are coming in for theft, and that includes retail fraud or larceny or stealing of any amount. We can also see that 7% of admissions are related to obstruction of justice, which includes failure to appear here and court process violations like contempt of court and failure to pay.
I'm sorry, wait. Obstruction of justice covers failure to pay?
Yeah, you didn't do what the court ordered you to do.
Got it.
It's a
Different commission chief.
Okay.
It's a pretty broad category, which means we had to kind of group it together in this way because so many things could kind of apply to it. So on the next slide, we can look at some of these categories by felony or misdemeanor distinction, because as you know, assault can be very different if it's a misdemeanor or if it's a felony. So the gray segments of each of these pie charts show the portion of admissions for assault and theft where we didn't know in the data if it was a felony or misdemeanor, so we leave that as not available. When it was available, you can see that a much larger portion of admissions were misdemeanors than felonies. So misdemeanors here are in teal and felonies are in dark blue. So at least half of theft offenses were for misdemeanors, which are generally any amount less than $1,000, and repeat offenses. Is that correct? Or
So the misdemeanor line is $1,000,
Yes.
and the problem is that the repeat offense bumps you up to the felony. So generally $1,000
Or
underneath
repeat
$1,000 is a misdemeanor and always will be a misdemeanor. But if it's your third offense, that could bump it into a felony, even though it's under $1,000.
Thank you, Judge. And on the other side, with the assault pie chart, we see that about half of the assaults were non-aggravated simple assaults. And you may have noticed on the last slide, we categorized domestic assaults separately. So domestic assaults aren't falling into these misdemeanor simple assaults. So here we're looking at offenses by race and also gender. We've listed again the top 5 most common charges at admissions and broken it out demographically. So let's look first at operating under the influence. This charge represents 14% of all jail admissions in our sample, but it's more pronounced for white people than black people. It represents 18% of jail admissions for white men and white women, and a much smaller percentage of jail admissions for black men and black women. Assault is pretty similar across the board. Driving without a valid license is a much more common reason for jail admission among black people in our sample than among white people. It represents 12% of jail admissions for black men and 15% of jail admissions for black women. Theft is a much more common reason for jail admissions among women compared to men. And drug possession is a more common reason for jail admissions among white women than other demographic groups. So on this next slide, we're pivoting away from criminal charges, and here we're looking at individuals within our sample. So let's first look at the shorter bar in the middle. This is tracking the number of individuals admitted to jail or admitted to the same jail within our sample who are booked a single time in the 3-year period. People who are booked more than once are in orange on the top. And you can see that there are more people in blue, 65% of the total, who are booked only once into that single jail in our 3-year period. Those pie slices to the right are looking at those who were booked multiple times and breaks out how many times they were booked. So of those people who came in multiple times, or of all people, 19% were admitted twice, 8% were admitted to jail 3 times, 4% were admitted 4 times, and another 4% were admitted 5 times or more in that 3-year period. So these repeat admissions, or these individuals who have repeat admissions in this 3-year period, make up 1/3 of all people admitted to jail. But as you can see in the bigger bar on the left, that they account for almost 2/3 of the total admissions because they're going to jail more than once in this time period.
Are we going to be able to break that down to see how many of those are fails to appear and how many of those are a financial obligation to the court?
Yeah, we can break down that table for you. I looked first a quick scan at demographics, and they were relatively similar. Repeat admissions tended to be a little bit younger and tended to have probation or parole violations. It was ranked a little bit higher in the top 10.
So over a 3-year period, some of those people will have 2 different crimes, but it's going to be a very small portion. It's going to be probation violations, failure to appears, and failure to meet a financial obligation, I guess, by and large.
We'll look into that a bit more, but those were some of the brief trends we saw initially. So in the last several slides, we've been looking at people coming into jail, jail admissions, and now we're looking at really those same people, but we're looking at how they exited jail or the reason that they were released. So because we had a diverse sample of 20 jails, which is a really great thing, it also meant that we weren't able to capture the release reason for every single person. It didn't standardize across different jails. So what we're showing here is the 78% of admissions where we could say that it fell under a sentence served, released to other agency, or bonded out category. And as you can see in this slide, 55% of people in that subsample were leaving jail, were released on bond. That could be a 10% bond, a surety bond, a PRR bond. Often the jail data is just saying bonded out. 13% were released to another agency, like the Michigan Department of Corrections, or to the authority of another local sheriff's office. And 32% of people were coming out of jail having finished serving a sentence. So often their release reason is saying something like time served or sentence served.
Do you think you could provide, I'm not sure, not necessarily demographics based on race, but perhaps socioeconomic demographics on the bonded out versus released to other agencies and sentenced? At least bonded out.
I would agree.
I don't think, we don't have the data to track individual financial information for each person in our jail data set. I'm trying to think of like a proxy to get at it. We could look at a specific county and maybe look at financial information in that county.
Or perhaps urban versus suburban even.
I mean, can you look at the race that of the person who bonded out?
Yes.
Because that would be critical to know. That's a financial ability to leave jail. And is that based on poverty, which may be urban, race-related?
Yes, we can definitely flag more of that. And like Terry alluded to, this is our kind of first cut at this data set. And some of, when we, hopefully with the court data, we can have kind of more reliability about the reason they're released. So we're trying to be a little bit conservative here about what we can see from this first cut. But please continue to highlight the things that you would like to get out of the data, and we'll do our best to try and get those.
Michelle, I'd like to see, go ahead.
No, you, go ahead.
I'd love to know, could you look at the total amount of money that was paid in bonds? So we get that, and then also who paid it? So whether it was a bail bondsman or individuals?
So I do not think we'll have who paid the bond amount in October. What I hope to have, at least for some subsample, is reliability about the bond amount information, and that seems to require the court with the jail data together. A lot of jails are capturing it, but not all of them in the sample, and there was a little bit less confidence of like exactly if that was the exact amount or if the bond might have changed. So at this point we weren't comfortable presenting that without kind of getting more verification, but that's definitely on the top of our list to try and bring back.
Good, thank you.
I think, again, there's only so much that we're going to be able to tell with data, and so we're going to have to also rely, to some extent, on public testimony. We're going to have to rely on, we can survey different practitioner groups, or we can put out, we're doing different roundtables with practitioners and different stakeholder groups. So we'll try through this process to gather as much qualitative information to contextualize what we see in the data, but sometimes the data is just not going to be available.
So I've worked for a few different pretrial service agencies, and I know all of the ones that I worked with at one time requested income information, and I'm wondering if if any of the data that you have came from those types of agencies, if you've taken a look at that, or if that's something potentially that could be investigated so that you could see the relationships between people that were able to bond out as opposed to stayed in the jails for longer periods.
That's a great flag, and the pretrial services here in Kent County has really shared with us a lot of information, and I will circle back with them and see if we can at least get that for Kent County, but I don't know if we could provide that with kind of a diverse sample, but some information, any information is worthwhile.
So just one more follow-up question on that. Did any of the 20 counties that you used in the study have pretrial services agencies, and if you know, how many of them?
That's a great question. I know Kent does, and Oakland off the top of my head, but we can do a more thorough review of them. Maybe half. But we'll get a better answer than maybe next time and provide it for you.
Michelle, I see that the total here that you have is 100%, but it doesn't account for dismissals. So how many were released from jail based on dismissals?
Right, so dismissals kind of fell into that category that we couldn't standardize across jails. So when I kind of alluded in the beginning that we're only representing kind of 78% of these releases where we could capture them, case dismiss was tracked in certain counties, but it wasn't in others, so we couldn't kind of fit it into one group. Similar to kind of the question about pretrial services agencies, we can certainly try and look at a smaller subsample of where it is available and let you know for, the couple counties that do track that consistently, how often that is the release reason.
Thank you.
So our next slide here is just looking at how long people are held in jail. And this whole donut, this whole pie, includes all of the release categories that we just saw. So a large portion, 45%, are in and out within a day. 22% stay in jail more than a day and up to 1 week. 16% stay more than a week and up to 1 month. 14% stay more than a month and up to 6 months, and a small portion, 3%, stay in jail longer than 6 months. Because that's such a big spread between the shortest and longest stays, the average jail stay, which is 22 days, you can see doesn't really represent most people's experience in jail. And if you're looking at national data, often the only thing that they can provide you is the average length of stay. So I think this brings a lot more clarity to how people cycle through jails and how long they spend.
So how did you look at cases where people were already serving a sentence and they overlapped because they were charged after they were, serving time for another offense and then were charged while they were in jail? What percent was that?
Great question. So this slide here is not looking at release categorization. So this is any person who is admitted, what was their admission date and what was their release date. And this next slide will kind of get at your question and we can dig into it a bit more. So here we're looking at the length of stay. Thanks. Here we're looking at a slightly simpler length of stay category, just less than a week, 1 week to 1 month, and more than 1 month. The lightest shade of blue represents those released in less than a week, the medium shade, those who stayed a week to 1 month in jail, and the darkest shade of blue represents those who stayed longer than a month. If we look at those who are released from jail on bond, that's the stacked bar on the right, 88% were out within a week, and the other 12% stayed longer before bonding out. But the length of stay here reflects the time in jail for that admission. It doesn't reflect the entire person, the entire time a person may spend pre-trial for one case. If they come into jail on a case, bond out, and come back again for whatever reason and bond out, this is just looking at that one jail stay. So if we look at the bar on the left, those who were released after serving a sentence, we see that 29% stayed less than 1 week, 33% stayed between 1 week and 1 month, and 38% stayed more than 1 month. But here too we have a qualifier. This length of stay isn't only time they spent in jail as sentenced inmates. This is just their disposition at time of release. So for people who are not released pre-trial but eventually were sentenced, that period of time in jail awaiting trial, then being sentenced and serving sentence, that entire time is all being captured in the bar on the left. And to the kind of policy questions people are bringing up, we hope we'll be able to kind of dig into that a little bit more and see what period of the sentence served length of stay category was awaiting trial versus actually kind of serving a sentence, or if it was immediately kind of a time served release. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So there's still a couple ways we can look at length of stay, though, even without knowing exactly what is pretrial information or pretrial time and what is sentence time. So here we're just looking at people who bonded out of jail, and we're looking at their length of stay disposition or length of stay period with a little bit more granularity. So the majority released in a day or less, 15% were released in 2 to 3 days, 6% in 4 to 7 days, 9% in 8 to 30 days, and 3% who stayed longer than 1 month. Recall, though, that the bonded out was the largest category, so even some of these small percentages account for thousands of people in the sample. And the research you heard last month in Traverse City also revealed that there are consequences potentially to even just a couple days in jail for individuals and potentially for public safety and recidivism.
I'm sorry, I just have a quick question that struck me. Is your data reflective at all of any post-conviction proceedings that perhaps somebody was sentenced, for example, to Michigan Department of Corrections, but that, let's say they come back to the county jail, they're written back there for an evidentiary hearing as part of their appeal? Did you come across any of that, or did that have was that a significant number in any way?
That wasn't a significant number. Someone who kind of was released as a writ out fell into our other category that we couldn't really standardize across the jail samples. So that's kind of excluded from this.
I see. Thank you.
So a few more slides on length of stay. On this slide, we cut length of stay by the seriousness of the charge. So at the top, we have felonies, and below that, we have misdemeanors. In the orange bars, we're looking at the mean length of stay. That's the average time spent detained for those released from jail during our sample years. In the blue bars, we're looking at the median, which is the midpoint in our length of stay. The median in all of these categories is much lower than the mean because there are so many people cycling in and out of jail quickly. The mean is higher because the longest stays are so much longer than the shortest stays, and they're pulling up the averages. The overall mean and median of length of stay are shown in the bars at the bottom of the slide. And this is looking at time in jail for the whole sample. So as you would expect, the more serious charges generally have the longer jail stays. Here we're showing length of stay spread for the 5 most common charges that people go to jail for. So just as an example, if we look at the 5th most common offense at admission, which is possession or use of a controlled substance, we see that 66% stayed less than 1 week, 18% stayed between 1 week and 1 month, and 16% stayed longer than 1 month. For these common offenses, the majority of people who come to jail on these charges are in and out within a week, but substantial numbers, because the sample is so big, stay longer than a week or longer than a month.
And there's nothing else going on with these people. It says that 17% of the people arrested for driving without a license stay longer than a week. There's no other matters going on with them? I mean, that...
So this isn't just the bonded out category, so it could be that that person was sentenced on an OWI charge or a DW.
Driving without a license, someone got more than a week in jail.
Do you have that by county? Do we know where those 17% are?
Livingston.
They're all in Livingston?
No, not all. I think we're all kind of shocked by why people are in jail right now. Is that fair to say?
Well, 17% on a driving without a valid license that are in jail for that length of time, I would love to know where that's
I mean,
happening.
it's fundamentally a tax crime.
Right.
It's not a public safety crime.
This is why it's a question.
And for the record, too, the theft is not burglary and things like that. This is retail fraud.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And we...
Very interesting.
Everyone's all worked up.
I don't want to copy out my own data, but we identified the most serious charge for this booking, but to Judge Boyd's point, there could be cases in which this person maybe has a very serious criminal history. We don't know, but there's a big portion of people here.
Could they also have a felony charge that they're in on?
A separate felony charge?
Correct.
Then they're going to be in a different data set.
Okay. So this is
the most serious charge.
This is the most serious charge.
So, right, and there, when there are multiple charges, we identified the most serious charge first by looking at felony and misdemeanor. Following that, we looked at the offense category, and we mirrored that off of the sentencing guidelines. So a person offense would be ranked next, followed by drug, property, public safety, and public order.
Thank you.
So, possession and use of controlled substance, I would like to know how many, so the percentages say, I see in jail, but do they go to do they go to an outpatient or rehab facility, or what happens once they leave jail?
I don't know. We could see for that category if it says they were released to another agency.
Right, that's what I mean.
I think and we'll definitely dig into that subsample, but just from the sense that I got, it's tracked so inconsistently, it would be a very small number, so I don't know how reliable it would be.
Can I ask a question? Would your operating while intoxicated be an operating while intoxicated second?
Yeah, it could be a felony or a misdemeanor, so it's just that entire
Okay, so
category.
it could be a felony or a misdemeanor. Because, I mean, I can tell you in Muskegon County, very few go to jail at all on a first offense. At all.
They're going to have a night in the, as the representative would say, the drunk tank, and that's going to count. That's going to show up.
Well, and I can tell you in Oakland County, there are judges that think it's cool to send everybody because they campaign on it for a weekend. Jalen Rose, the ESPN commentator, got 3 days in jail for being a .09.
Yeah, no.
So
It's been like a campaign theme for some judges, and then they feel like that's foul.
That's against our ethics rules.
I'm aware of that.
Well, I mean, but it is a one of the rock solid, valid public safety things to take someone who's too drunk to drive someplace where they're safe. So that 1 day in jail till the next morning when they're bonded out for money or for PR, no jail's going to let somebody go until they're back to zeros and they can be released safely into the community. So those big numbers, that 45% of 1 day or less, a lot of them are those. That's why it's 77%, because they blow zeros at 7 in the morning and they go home.
I think what Judge Boyd might be pointing out without even knowing it is it would be nice to have this separated into 1 day and then more than 1 day to 1 week. Because a lot of people are just, we're not allowed, the police are not allowed to let someone back on the street if they've been drinking and driving.
Right.
And so you're going to count that as 1 day to 1 week. So you should separate 1 day and then separate 2 days to a week.
Right, so it's on here. So we can do something like this category for each of those offenses that you just saw and bring it back. And the other level of detail we can provide with something like OWI and theft, which could be a range, is we can say whether or not it was a felony or a misdemeanor. We can't say because of the different codes, was this their third, was this their fourth, was it super drunk, but we can cut it by felony, misdemeanor, and not available. Okay. So because of these length of stay dynamics that we talked about, a lot of people cycling in for pretty short stays, we actually see a fairly big difference between the makeup of jail admissions and the makeup of the jail population on a given day. So in case this isn't intuitive, I'll use an analogy. Picture a jail with two revolving doors, one marked misdemeanor and the other marked felony. The misdemeanor door revolves a lot quicker than the felony door, so even when there's a lot more people in that group, they're generally in and out of the jail quicker than those going through the felony door. The felony door revolves more slowly, so people enter the jail through that door and have a harder time leaving. There's fewer of them coming in throughout that year, but because they don't leave quickly, there's more of them in the jail on a given day. So here's what that dynamic looks like in a bar graph. And the admissions bar, representing all of the people who came to jail between 2016 and 2018, the majority is the people with misdemeanor charges. But in the jail population bar, which is when we're looking at that jail population on December 1st, 2018 for our sample, we see that the majority of people have felony charges. So now we're going to shift from talking about admissions to shifting to talking about the jail population on a given day. Here is the top 10 most common charges for people who are sitting on jail on a given day in our sample. So there's a lot of overlap here with the most common crimes that people were admitted for. Assault, domestic violence, and other person offenses are on both lists. Drug possession and probation violations are also on both lists, as are drunk driving and drug sales. The difference really is the order, because people don't generally get out of jail as quickly for person offenses and probation violations. Those charges are more likely to be found in the jail population on a given day. So here we're looking at length of stay for this jail population, and we're breaking it down by crime class. So this slide likely looks familiar because we just saw it for jail admissions. The orange bar is the mean length of stay, and the blue bar is the median length of stay. So for a person in jail on a given day, half of them had already spent 53 days in jail, and on average they had served 97 days in jail so far. If we think back to the jail admissions slide, we see a stark difference. The average length of stay of all admissions was much shorter, 22 days, and at least half of them would say they were only in jail for 2 days or less. So length of stay for jail admissions is different because the sample is much larger. Hundreds of thousands of people who cycled through our 20 jails between 2016 and 2018, a large portion of whom were in and out pretty quickly, different from the jail population on a given day. So we've spent a few slides now talking about length of stay dynamics, and you might be wondering why that's important. So this last graph is an attempt to explain why. On this slide, we're looking at who's actually taking up Michigan's jail beds. The light blue bars represent the people admitted to jail broken out by how long they stay. Less than a week to a month, and more than a month. And the dark blue bars represent how much space they actually take up in Michigan's jails. The term we use for that is jail bed days. So if we look at the two bars on the left, they tell us that 66% of people admitted to jail were in and out in less than a week. That's a couple 100,000 jail admissions, which is a lot. But they only took up 5% of the jail space occupied between 2016 and 2018. A lot of individuals' lives were affected, but it didn't cause a lot of jail beds to be filled for many during our 3-year sample period. Now let's look at the two bars on the right side of the graph. This shows us that a relatively small portion of jail admissions, 17%, stayed in jail longer than a month. But that group accounted for nearly all of the jail space occupied between 2016 and 2018. That small group had an outsized impact on Michigan's high jail populations. So the takeaway is, policymakers in Michigan who want to address the costs and collateral harms of jail incarceration have two separate problems to face. First, the very large number of people whose lives are disrupted by short jail stays, and second, the relatively small number whose long stays drive up jail bed use. They're separate problems and likely require separate policy solutions. So picture, for example, that you reduce the number of people who cycle in and out of jail in less than a week, or even imagine that you completely eliminated the 66% of jail admissions that are in and out in less than a week. That would immediately impact hundreds of thousands of people who might otherwise lose jobs or experience other collateral harms for short jail stays, but it would only reduce Michigan's jail population by about 5%. Now picture the opposite, focusing just on reducing jail population. To have the biggest impact, you look just at the 17% who are held in jail longer than a month. If you can shorten their jail stays, you can drive down jail populations across the state. But if you focus just on them, then you're not addressing the harms caused to the larger numbers of people who are cycling in and out through short jail stays.
I just want to repeat, I do think that the less than a week's going to have to change to 1 day. I mean, as a judge, and I think Judge Boyd will say, there are so many, two things, dangers to the public safety with that 1 day of incarceration that are eliminated, and they're just musts with public policy, the drunk drivings, the domestic violences, but also for the defendant, the ability to be properly identified. When we get individuals who are not lodged, the identification problems when their case comes to trial can often be much more difficult. So I do think that it needs to be separated 1 day, then 2 days to 1 week.
Even just 1 day and 2 days to 1 week? Okay.
Yeah, because what I'm trying to say is that 1 day is often
Very
critical for the prosecutor, victims, future victims. In other words, again, if someone's, just high, drunk, in volatile situation, when it's a domestic violence or an assault, that one day is what is often called the cool down period, or where the defendant has gotten to the 0 instead of a 0.17 when they're driving, or allegedly committing a crime. But also, there are many things that happen in the jail that protect the defendant identification-wise. For example, often if someone is given a citation and they are not lodged, again, I want to repeat that usually someone gets a citation and they are lodged, but if they get a citation and they are not lodged, a common problem can be identification, particularly in urban areas where people use someone else's name to avoid being arrested because they know they have warrants out for their arrest. It happens all the time.
Well, but to that point, on this slide, many jail admissions were for nonviolent offenses. Because I agree with the point you're making about the one day.
But it happens with a driving while license suspended, or it happens with a minor traffic ticket, because if Mr. Smith gets stopped, but they know they have warrants for their arrest, they will use Mr. White's name.
No, I understand. I was just going to say that from what they reviewed, 32% of the admissions, of which I assume goes for that 5% that we're talking about, was for driving without a license, probation or parole violation, possession of a controlled substance, and obstruction of justice. And if you add in theft, that's 40% of jail admissions. That I'm not sure, for what you said, that for that one day, do you really need to hold a person for that one day on some of these charges that drive such a high
But even 1 hour is going to be counted as a day. And if you don't book the person, their identification is often lost. And oftentimes, particularly in urban areas, people will use other people's names. I mean, in today's day and age, it can be a little easier because there's cameras everywhere, but I cannot tell you how many people use other people's names to avoid arrest on a citation where they're not going to get lodged.
We might be slipping into debates we should have later once we have even more data, and we can, I think the idea of breaking it down by one day versus
Right.
will be really helpful, but
that's all I'm indicating.
Whether jail is the right place to figure out someone's identity is something we can talk about.
Right.
It might not be, but we can talk about that later.
And it might not be, but my point was just 1 day versus 2 days to 1 week.
That's a good suggestion.
And this was our last, other than a takeaways and acknowledgement slide, so we can hear more comments.
What I didn't see, and someone please correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while, but is there still a 180-day psych eval rule in Michigan? And if so, how many of these jailers are in jail awaiting that psych eval?
So that's a great question. And Dr. Kubiak will probably have more information than I, so I'm just going to punt it to her. But it was hard to tell with the jail data sample that we had specific information about who was being housed for that reason and when they were released for that reason, so we couldn't see that. So that would have fallen into that kind of other category that we couldn't capture.
Okay.
We've got just a quick takeaway slide and acknowledgements, and then we will be all finished. Okay, so here are some takeaways that stood out to us, with the important caveat about citations often resulting in lodges and that being a variation. But despite falling arrests, particularly among young people, tens of thousands of people are still arrested for low-level charges like failure to appear in court, marijuana possession, and shoplifting. People are also going to jail in larger numbers for administrative rule breaking, like driving without a valid license and violating probation conditions. Officers issue fewer citations in lieu of arrests than they have in past years. And overall, arrests far outnumber citations, even for low-level crimes. Short jail stays disrupt hundreds of thousands of lives, but Michigan's high jail populations are driven by relatively few people. And last, we just wanted to again thank all the people who participated to pull this data together. At the top, we have the State Court Administrative Office and Michigan State Police. And following that, we have each of the 20 counties who provided data, in addition to the time and cooperation from the sheriff. Staff within those offices each had to work with us to pull this data together and review it with us to make sure we understood it. And even to end up with 20 counties of data, we worked with even more counties who were willing, but because of technical capacities, it didn't quite pan out. Special thanks also to Ingham County, Ottawa, Calhoun, Marquette, Cass, Menominee, who were open to this participation and really put in some effort to try and provide jail data. All right.
All right, thank you. This slide here also has the website and contact information for Terry and Michelle, and this website listed is where the presentation will be available for people to download and to dig into. And also the email address here is where people can submit questions and ideas or additional material. With that, I think we're ready for a break to stretch out, and we will reconvene at 11:45 for our next presentation.
Thank you.